Okay, so we're on our third key point that we're going to be looking at. We've already looked at the structure of the hair, and we discussed in detail a little bit more about the changes that can be made to the hair as well. So now we need to actually look at the curl guide chart so we understand specifically what are the differences within the curl structure itself when we look at the hair closely. So what you see here on my board is that I've listed the 4 hair groups that we actually have. So one thing I want to mention is that if any of you are hairdressers and you've done your hairdressing course, if you remember back, if you look at the hairdressing book, you realize that there's only 3 hair groups that are mentioned. And in terms of the diagrams that we see, there are 3 that are described in that. So you usually find Caucasian and Asian and Afro hair textures within the 3 hair groups that are mentioned. And they'll have these kind of similar diagrams to just give you an idea of what the structure of the hair actually looks like. But we now know that we actually have a 4th hair group in there. So that's the multi-textured hair. We discussed what multi-textured hair is. So it's a key thing to note that we actually have 4 hair groups because each of these hair groups require different products that we need to use and different styling techniques. Some of them will be similar, kind of like your Caucasian and Asian hair texture groups. The products and the styling techniques are likely going to be similar or more or less the same. And then with your multi-textured hair, it's going to be focusing on curly hair, and the products that we use for that is going to be specifically designed for that hair group. So I just put this here so that it helps us to really start to understand that. I realized recently when I was teaching somewhere else that not everyone really knows what Caucasian or Asian hair texture is. It might seem like it's crazy. How can no one not really know what Caucasian hair is? But I was training in a training academy recently, and I asked the students, do we know what Caucasian hair is? And my reply was a lot of silence and very unsure faces staring back at me. They were a little bit afraid to kind of guess what it possibly could be. So I realized as an educator, I needed to just explain that and break it down so we all are on the same page. So when I reference Caucasian hair or Asian hair, you have an idea visually in your mind what we're talking about. Okay, so we know that Caucasian hair is predominantly going to be those who are Caucasian will have this hair texture. We're looking at hair that is naturally straight, silky in how it looks and how it feels. You have varying degrees of textures within this as well. So for example, if you're Caucasian and you're from the UK, so when we talk about Caucasian, it means someone who is white. If they're from either the UK, America, any place in the world where they are white and they have this hair texture, this is what we're talking about when I'm talking about Caucasian hair, for example. And then when we talk about Asian hair, whenever I ask this question, the first answer I get, are we talking about Chinese hair, Japanese? That is usually the country that I usually get reference from, but we'll just break that down a little bit more. So within the Asian hair group, you notice that I put my little attempt to drawing the diagrams there. So we have straight hair, slightly wavy, and then we have a little bit more of a tighter wave, and then we have the tighter curls in that as well. So with your Asian hair group, I'll give you examples of countries. So countries that come to mind, we've got China, we've got Japan, Korea, Thailand, you've got Malaysia, you've got India. And if you think about the African continent, we have countries there where people would actually have hair texture that's classed as Asian hair texture. So we're talking about Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, that part of the African continent. So that'll be north. I'm not too good with my geography, so I'm hoping I'm referencing this correctly. So further up north, if we look at the African continent, that's where you find mostly the hair textures that are still classed as Asian hair textures in that as well, okay? And what we also have is your multi-textured hair. We discussed that we know that's curly hair textures. Those who are mixed race, they will have this hair texture here. And then we have the Afro hair group, that is the tightly coiled hair texture, okay? So that's it with some of the countries that we can reference regarding to Asian hair textures. But also another thing I want you to note that is just because someone is classed as having Asian hair, they might not necessarily be from that part of the world. So for example, if we look at countries like Brazil or Venezuela, so South American countries essentially, You have those who might not necessarily be, if we're looking at them ethnicity wise, they might not be referenced as being Asian, but the curl pattern and the structure of the hair is very much similar to Asian hair textures. Another group that we could think of is, if you think of the Aborigines in Australia, naturally they could be classed as being black in terms of how some of them look like, and some could be classed as being Asian in terms of how they look like, depending on how you want to class them, if you want to do that. But essentially, specifically the hair, I actually had this question from a student, and after referencing this, she was looking at some images. She did ask me, so if you're talking about Aborigine hair, how would you class that? Because it's got elements of some of the hair looking similar to Afro hair texture, but the hair is very, very curly. But when we looked at the images a little bit more, we realized it's much more closer to similar to being classed as Asian hair texture. So there is going to be some elements where you have to just focus on what you're seeing when you're looking at the hair, and not so much the ethnicity of that individual. So this kind of helps you to kind of break down the structure of the hair and figure out what are the main things that that hair group would need. So if, for example, if I'm styling hair that is quite similar to Asian hair textures, I need to know what kind of products should I be using, what kind of cutting techniques can I do, what are the things I'm able to do with that hair. That will help you to make a decision as to what you do moving forward. And it's the same thing with all your multi-textured hair. So your multi-textured hair, we already know that someone who is mixed race, the hair is naturally quite curly. There's varying degrees of curls in that. And with our Afro hair texture, we know that it's naturally kinky coiled hair, and that's going to be fine on someone who is of black descent, and their hair texture is always going to be naturally kinky coiled, but there's changes that can be done to change the structure of the hair. Now, if we focus on what I want to share with you, specifically the curl guide chart, some of you might be familiar with this already. You might have heard of this, you might have seen this before, you might have seen images that are linked to the numbering and the lettering system as well, okay? So if we look at our type 3 hair texture, the type 3 hair texture is predominantly hair that is always going to be curly. There is going to be varying degrees of curls when we look at that. So when we look at this here, when we talk about the lettering and the numbering system, so it actually starts from number 1, 2 to 4. Okay, so if I just put it here, so number 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I'll explain that shortly. So the numbers, they represent the hair group and also the physical curl structure that you're seeing when you're literally looking at the hair. So we have numbers 1, 2, and 4. Number 1 is where you're going to find your straight hair. Number 2 is where you're going to find the hair that is wavy. And number 3 is hair that is going to be curly. And number 4 is hair that is tightly coiled. Within the number 1 and number 2, this is where you find your Asian and Caucasian hair groups. You have varying degrees of curl patterns. You have hair that is super straight, goes into a wave, a much more tighter wave, and then it goes into a tight curl. Varying degrees of curl patterns, and then varying degrees of tightness of the curl. And then your number 3 is specifically for multi-textured hair. So if someone has got very, very curly hair, they're Caucasian, their hair is very, very curly. You get some people with curly hair that is to the point where it sits more in like an afro. We're not gonna say they've got multi-textured hair because we know they're Caucasian, so they wouldn't be classed as being mixed race. Although the curl pattern has elements to similarities to what multi-textured hair is, they're still going to be either type 2 hair that is very, very curly. I hope that makes a little bit more sense for you guys. And then you have what we're focusing on is our type 3 hair texture here, which is your multi-textured hair. You have varying degrees of curls. And number 4 is always going to be specifically for Afro hair texture, okay? The letters that you see, they just represent the degree of how tight or loose a curl or a wave is going to be. So for example, if I say someone is a type 1C, it just means that their hair is Caucasian or is Asian hair texture. It's predominantly looking more straight, but when we add the C to that, it just means that the hair is very, very curly. It's Caucasian hair or Asian hair that is very, very curly. If we say someone has got a 2C hair texture, again, it's referencing the same thing. What we're focusing on for the theory that I'm covering, we're focusing on type 3 and type 4 hair textures. So this is our multi-textured hair. We have varying degrees of how tight the curl is. If we look at type 3A hair texture, we'll have a slightly more looser curl. It's a little bit more softer, there's less frizz in the hair. The curl structure of a 3A is much more closer to a type 2 hair texture that is Caucasian or Asian hair texture. in the terms that there's a little bit more of a silkiness to it, a little bit more definition. So if someone is mixed race and they have a 3A hair texture, it just means that the dominant DNA pattern, if you like, of that person is more of the Caucasian or the Asian hair side of the family compared to the Afro hair. So there's less elements of Afro hair in that, but there's a lot more of the Caucasian hair. And then we have our 3B. Now the curl pattern is getting a little bit more tighter. The curls are getting much more smaller. So we're talking about hair that's got more like a corkscrew type of curl, okay? There's elements of more frizz to the hair. It's going to dry out a little bit more, so we need to focus on adding moisture, and our products are likely going to change in the consistency the further up we go here. And then our 3C, we have hair texture that is much more tightly curled, gradually going into a more of a coil. Because at this point, if someone has got 3C hair, the dominant curl pattern is Afro with a little bit of the Asian or Caucasian hair in there. So if we look at images of a 3C hair texture, you notice that if I hadn't shared with you guys what multi-textured hair is different to Afro hair, when you look at the image of someone with 3C hair, you're naturally going to probably say that hair is Afro textured hair. But the fact that when you look at the hair, if you can see curls in the hair, that should tell you that is multi-textured hair. Because with our Afro hair, we don't see any curls unless the person has changed their hair texture to have curls. That's what you're going to see. Now, when we look at our type 4 hair, we know that is tightly kinky coiled hair texture. The degree of the curl pattern changes now. We're dealing with more tight coils than curls in the hair. The thickness of the hair can change depending on where we're placing the individual in terms of like whether they've got 4B hair or 4C hair texture. The shrinkage that you get within this hair texture changes as well. If this hair is wet, it's likely going to shrink, but this is going to shrink more because the level of the tightness of the curl, or the coil should I say, is much more compared to your 4A. So when we talk about type 4 hair textures, visually the hair kind of all looks the same, but when you start to feel the hair, when you start to style the hair, you can notice the difference. When we look at type 3 hair, you can tell straight away if someone is going to be a 3A versus a 3C, because visually you can see the massive difference within the curl structure. But with your Afro hair texture type 4, the hair is tightly packed and it's tightly coiled. You can't visually see the difference, but when you start to style the hair and you feel the hair, that's when you can really tell the difference between whether someone is more of a 4A or a 4C. So this is pretty much what we're talking about when we're referencing the curl guide chart. So as we get further into some of our tutorial videos and we reference, okay, I'm styling type 3A hair, these are the products that I'm using. Hopefully this breakdown helps you to really understand what type 3A hair is and what type 4A hair texture is actually going to be. And also another thing to note is what happens to the hair when it's wet. I'll just briefly mention, whenever you're working with your curly hair textures, when the hair is wet, it's going to stretch in length. So you're not seeing the true length of that hair. When Afro hair is wet, it naturally shrinks. So this is very important for us as hairstylists, especially if we're doing things like cutting. We need to know that if I'm going to cut curly hair when it's wet, I'm not necessarily seeing the true length. So I need to always remember to leave room to allow the hair to then bounce back to its natural state in terms of how tight the curl is in relative terms to how much length you want to lose in that hair when you're cutting the hair. And also with your type 4 hair, if you're cutting men's hair, for example, you're constantly having to comb out the hair with your Afro peak. So every time you comb out the hair, it stretches and then it gradually starts to shrink back. So you're constantly combing out the hair while you're cutting at the same time. So it's very important just to understand the things that happen to the hair when it's wet, when it's dry, and also just understanding the differences within the structure of the hair, because knowing this is going to help us when we start looking at products and the hairstyling techniques. If I know that I'm working on 3A hair, and I'll probably need to know what kind of products can I use for this hair here, what kind of products can I use if I'm working with 3B, what kind of products can I use if I'm working with 4C, what if someone has a combination of a predominant curl pattern is 3A, but around the temple area and the crown area is 3C. what product should I be using? Should I mix and match products? Should I use something else completely? So just understanding this first is going to help us for the next part when we talk about the products and the styling techniques we need to use for our type 3 hair and our type 4 hair textures.